All right, hi everyone. Today I'm going to be sharing the report of findings from the research that we conducted with operators to understand their information needs, particularly when trying to solve problems that go wrong at their workplace. So, just a quick overview of some of the main findings is that we learned that operators really follow a very similar process in looking for information to come up with a solution for their problem. Typically, they're starting out with just a basic understanding of the problem so they can isolate it and find out what really is going on here and what are the first steps they're going to take. So typically, they're using resources like Google and doing a search or using some of their internal resources like notes that they have, past tickets, or information that's provided by their company on how to handle certain issues. Once they've finished that sort of initial understanding, if the problem's still not resolved, they typically then reach out to an external source. And most often, this is another person. So a coworker or maybe another operator in the community that understands their problem space. And for their purposes, they're looking for someone who has sort of a different perspective, someone who's going to share some alternate ideas for what they can do to work on the problem at hand. If they still can't figure out the solution to the problem, what they're going to do at this point is that the operators will look through the code, and they'll do this to just try to get a more granular idea, to pinpoint that issue, find out where it's really happening, and see if it's actually a bug or not, and maybe go on to have a fix that they themselves will initiate. And in talking about potential like solutions to getting information better, a lot of operators said that just having a better organization of information is going to help them find what they need quicker. Obviously, that open source is OpenStack has a lot of a wide variety of resources, and just having a better grasp of where they need to look and where for that would really help them in their information needs. So here's a little bit of the details of how the research was conducted. We spoke to 7 people in individual interviews, and these interviews lasted about 45 to 50 minutes on average. And we talked about what those operators are doing in their day-to-day routine, some of the issues that they encounter typically, and then more about how they go about finding information, what tactics they use, what resources, and how that process works out for them specifically in their context. We spoke to people from a mix of companies. They had various cloud sizes and also a range of experience. We had, about 2 to 3 years experience on average for people, ranging from someone who was just getting started with OpenStack to someone who had almost 5 years of experience and was quite knowledgeable. So the interview followed this process loosely, talked about their background and to try to get an understanding of where they come from, typical problems that they face. And then we dug a little deeper into understanding how they typically go through a method for finding information. What if they still can't find it no matter what they're trying? What happens at those particular points? How often are they relying on their own knowledge versus seeking information from an outside source? From there, we talked about efficiency. So maybe how much time they're spending looking for information opposed to actually implementing solutions or fixes, or going on share information, both internally and with others in the OpenStack community. And last, we covered potential solutions. So things that would help them find information better, things that would help them get to their information faster. And then we sort of wrapped up and had some final thoughts. And that's typically how the interviews went. Also on this slide is a description of the persona that we are targeting, so you can really understand the types of operators that we spoke to. In this case, they are cloud operators. This next section, I'll talk a little bit about some of the main findings, things that really stood out in the research. So we talked a little bit in the executive summary about that three-step process that operators typically go through to find information, to resolve their problems. So this first stage typically then is a Google search or a search of their local information. And this is just to understand basic information at this point. These operators want to understand what they're working on, really fundamentally understand the context of the problem so that they know what to try first. So a lot of people did mention Google. It's a very quick and easy way that they're getting a wide variety of resources. So some typical ones that were mentioned: Ask.OpenStack, Launchpad, even OpenStack documentation turned up in that Google search. And so that sort of scoped their initial step in learning about what they can do to solve their problem. And if Google wasn't the starting point, for some people, they said that they might look at local documentation before they reach out to Google. Maybe there's a past ticket that someone at their company has worked on that was similar, and they can leverage that information. Or maybe there's something in the log that they've maybe seen before, and so that may give them some hints and clues on how to go about solving that problem. Other people mentioned that their company maintained documents on how to handle typical problems, or wikis where everyone could put their learnings in one place so that different operators could tackle a problem and not have to rely on finding that one person who solved the problem in the past. And so this step was mostly important for people to get sort of a memory aid to remember what they should do first, or they were describing it as a trigger that is sort of sparking something that tells them, okay, I need to try this, this, and this in how to solve the problem. If this initial information gathering isn't solving their problem, what operators are doing is then going to find a more direct source of information. So instead of relying on Google or their local documentation to remind them how to go about something, they're going to look for something that's a little bit more specific to their problem, like a coworker that maybe has more experience than them, or another colleague that they're familiar with that can help them, or someone in the community. So when reaching out to the community, two different ways of doing this were frequently mentioned: IRC channels and also mailing lists. And there were pros and cons for each one of these methods. The IRC was typically faster in getting a response, but it was maybe a little bit more unreliable on whether a question might get answered. And this is due to either the chat being too busy, maybe having nobody there when your question is asked, or maybe you don't have enough, people aren't recognizing you and you don't have enough credibility in the channel that someone is going to reach out and answer your question. So mailing lists were a little bit slower on the other hand, but they were typically would have a response within a couple of days. So a little bit more reliable and often had more detail in the response as opposed to asking a question on the RIC channel. Usually the last thing that operators are doing to try to get information to solve their problem is to go back to the code and look at it and try to understand what's going on from that level. Here they're trying to understand, well, what part of what project is going wrong, and maybe it's a bug. So this is often very time consuming, and it's, they're going through each of these code line by line to check for problems. So it's typically why this is sort of the last step of their process. So a couple participants mentioned that they might bring in another person at the stage to help them, usually a developer. And this might be someone on their team who's a little bit more familiar with that level, or it might be someone who has worked on that project of OpenStack and is familiar with that particular area. And a lot of people also said that they would test the problem, sometimes replicating that same issue in a test environment where they can sort of play with it, try some solutions, see what works out, and kind of almost using either brute force, changing their parameters to get at a solution at that point. And as you can tell here by the quote at the top, sometimes they just have to fix it themselves when they've tried all other methods. So next, I'll talk about a few other things that we learned during the interviews that weren't really related to the process of finding information, but are important to understand because they play a role in how information is sought out and shared. First, we asked the participants about how much are they relying on their own knowledge versus knowledge that's out there in the world. So either things that they knew beforehand or things that they're learning by reaching out to an outside source. And most people said that they relied on their own knowledge for figuring out a solution. And as we said before, sometimes they're using things like Google or other resources to trigger their memory into remembering what they should do in a certain situation. These people do handle a lot of different problems on a daily basis, so it's hard to keep that information right on the tip of your tongue. And, basically that ratio looked like 80% their own knowledge to 20% other knowledge. And there was a little bit less experienced participant who said it was about 50-50. So a person's personal knowledge is playing a large role in their information needs here. And an interesting thing that was related to that was that, cheat sheets or maybe, a personal collection of information that someone's found along the way wasn't really used consistently. So there were some people who had their own notes. There were other people who relied on their company to provide some of that basic knowledge. And some people didn't have that sort of resource at all. So that sort of thing varied, even though people typically were working from their own knowledge. When people reached out to other individuals to get help finding information, it was usually for a very advanced problem or maybe something that they haven't seen before. And a lot of people said that they typically had one person that they saw as a guru that they would reach out to, that they knew that they had a lot of experience and that they were generally helpful in sort of thinking out of the box and helping them with difficult problems. So these gurus typically were coworkers or peers, and a lot of people that we talked to were pretty experienced, and some even identified themselves as the guru, and they often talked about helping others at their company work on problems as well. And basically the benefits here from having this guru is that they provided another perspective, sort of a fresh look at that problem after that operator has spent, their time trying to troubleshoot it from their own perspective. talking about time spent looking for information to solve their problems, that most of the time being spent on an issue is time spent looking for the information. So in other words, the time spent that they're using to fix that problem is generally less than that of trying to figure out what's wrong. So a lot of people gave ratios that were about 70 to 30. So 70% of their time looking for information, 30% or less time fixing it based on that information that they found. And obviously this varies. Like we said before, sometimes if a problem's more difficult or if it's something new that they haven't seen before, they might spend more time trying to figure out what they need to solve their problem. So, for example, a simple problem might only take 5 to 10 minutes to address, while as a more complex problem could take a few days of work and could involve an entire team of people working on the same issue. In terms of sharing information, most people said that internally they would share that information first with their team or their company so that they understood what the issue was and how they resolved it, and then share information with the community in case that others have a similar problem and need help later. So for the internal communications, typically they used email. Other people said that they might share these findings in a meeting or sort of a debrief session where they brainstorm about, well, why did the problem happen in the first place? What can we do to prevent this problem in the future? So they would kind of almost have a postmortem then of the issue, what information they thought was helpful, and what were the steps they went through to solve their issue. When sharing in the community, most typical ways to do this involved mailing lists or in the IRC. Other people also mentioned that they could write blogs describing the problem. A few said that they do this personally, and others said that they write blogs on behalf of their company. And a few others said that they sometimes share the results of their problem at a meetup. So kind of sharing the information with others with an interest of that particular area. Slack was also mentioned for communication, especially with customers. And Slack was typically used both during a troubleshooting process, so keeping the customer informed about what was being done, and then at the end to communicate how the issue was resolved and how they would fix it in the future. A few participants reflected on their ideas of having notes in the code that might help them find out a little bit more about what problem was occurring. And we found out that most of the participants were neutral towards this idea. And they really felt that it was conditional depending on what was actually written in those notes. So if the message was relatively succinct, if they kind of got to the point and just shared some of the basic contextual information, this was seen as better as having more things to read, because reading takes time. And if an operator's looking in the code, they're generally at the last step in their process to trying to figure out what's wrong. So they're not really going to want to take a lot of time at this point. Additionally, the content of that note is important. Operators are looking for some context of the problem, maybe understanding how the problem came up in the first place, not just that it's a problem and that it needs to be fixed. And there were some varying opinions. One person in particular thought that the more information that is in the code, the more chance that you might mislead someone, or that person might not understand the message. So it's best just to be concise as possible and keep the notes in the code simple. Other people also reflected on error messages and how those come into play in their information finding. And most people said that error messages were useful, but they really wanted more detail in what those messages were conveying. So more rich information, so as much detail as possible about why that error occurred, where, and other contextual clues. Oftentimes people are Googling the error message to get a more, quote unquote, plain English interpretation of what that error is. So some participants said that if that plain English explanation was there in the first place, it would reduce their process by one step. Another thing that was found to be a little bit hard to work with the error messages is that they may get an error in one project, but the actual origination of the problem might be in another, and it's hard to sort of trace their steps back to find out where that is. So if the error messages could relate to each other across the projects, it would be much easier than having to trace that manually themselves. Another person said that having the error messages pushed upstream for fixes might be able to catch things sooner and fix bugs faster if there are things such as, known problems within that project. So the next section, we'll talk a little bit about potential solutions. So things that operators felt would help them finding information easier and faster. One of the common themes was improving the organization of the information, that everything that they needed was out there. It's just not in the way that they expected to find it. So some of the suggestions for improving organization involved creating a knowledge base. So almost having like a log where people can look at what problems were encountered and how they were solved, what solutions were implemented. One participant was talking about this, and he likened it to Wikipedia, something where you can learn about different topics. And this would help people be proactive. So understanding what they might do if that certain problem happened to them, rather than being reactive and scrambling to find a solution, especially if it's in a time-sensitive situation. Another suggestion was to use a template so that people are collecting the same types of information, especially in terms of their environment, so that there's a common understanding of what's happening and why they may have chose a particular solution or gone down a certain path. It's very widely varies, the architecture, and so understanding what the situation is there really helps people understand when reading about past solutions that others have implemented. And finally, best practices for certain things that are very common would be good to know, especially in this whole area of having contextual information. So why someone chose a particular solution, and maybe what's a more graceful way to handle something if there are many ways to solve a problem. Other participants said that they couldn't get enough of information, and so if they had more information, it would help them find what they need. So a few people mentioned that Google was a really great resource for them in order to find a lot of different information sources, and so that they really wanted to optimize their search for Google results. And it would really streamline them, their workflow to have to understand where the resources were and where typically they find information. Also, having resources from other companies would help operators, especially if they're part of a small team or company. So just sharing information more widely, especially from companies that maybe have more resources or experience more problems because they've got a larger environment. So to have a robust database of information that's accessible for everybody. And also having more details in OpenStack logs would help some participants that say that they turn to the logs to understand what's going on and that they are looking for all the information as possible to look at what's different between this log where there was an issue versus a log when everything was running smoothly. So the more information, the better they can pinpoint where a problem actually is originating. Finally, some people spoke about how OpenStack documentation might be improved to better suit their needs. So having more operator focused documents, or just kind of more information on the documentation that already exists would help, especially since operators have a unique perspective where they're managing a lot of things at once. And a few people mentioned that the documentation was more developer focused. So having documents that are approaching problems and solutions from their perspective would definitely help. Another participant said that being able to comment within a certain page of documentation might help, especially in the situation of setup. So you're typically looking at documentation while you're setting up OpenStack, and it would be helpful to understand maybe some of the things that could typically go wrong in certain processes and how to fix it, and have that information right there in one page so that you wouldn't have to break your workflow to stop and look up possible solutions elsewhere before returning back to the documentation, that everything would be collected in one area. Also, having reference architectures was seen as helpful. And this would kind of provide examples of how operators could solve problems in many different situations. So OpenStack is very customizable, and there are many ways that that software can work together. So the more examples that are out there, the more references, the more likely that someone's going to find a setup that's very similar to their own so that they can kind of understand what their best approach might be. All right, and so that's the end of our presentation today. So I kind of want to reflect on some of the things that I found interesting while working on this project. One thing that really surprised me was how similar each of the operators that we talked to, how similar their process was for finding information. A lot of people felt that they, maybe departed from what normally happens. But overall, that sort of three-step process where people are Googling to understand the basics, reaching out to other people, whether in forums, IRC, or mailing lists, and then going into the code. And especially that step, a lot of people felt that other operators might not do that sort of thing, but almost all of the operators that we spoke to actually did look at the code to try to figure out when everything else wasn't working. So that was one of the things that really stood out to me. Directions for further research might include talking to people who are involved in cloud architecture. So the people who kind of think about why they might set up a certain way to solve a business need. And they could also provide another perspective as these cloud operators do, since their information needs are a little bit different. They're looking for information on, how they're going to set up and why that's important versus on solving a problem. So I think involving those other individuals would really round out the type of information that we already are collecting. In addition, the Ops Summit is coming up, and I think that would be a great opportunity to engage people on the next steps in finding a solution. So seeing what might have the biggest impact, what might be the most feasible to implement. We had a lot of great potential solutions, and I think more research into that, into narrowing down into something that we can take action to actually get a solution up would be a great next step from there.